Did you know when it comes to mobility training, there is a huge difference between a biological and neurological restriction? Importantly, the training to overcome one is going to be different than the other. In this video, I'm going to explain the difference between overcoming a biological and a neurological restriction so you don't waste your time using the wrong approach. That way you can focus on what truly works. To keep it simple, the word biology in this context pertains to any physical structures in the body such as bone, joints, connective tissue, muscles. The neurology pertains to the nervous system's ability to control and coordinate movement. Let's use a helpful analogy. When we say biology and neurology in the body, it's very akin to hardware and software in a computer. Biology would be the hardware. In this case, this is the physical components of the computer that determine the amount of space, the processing speed, and how many applications it can run as once. Just like a computer, hardware issues in the body could pertain to something like a tight muscle or a stiff joint or something else that's part of the structure of the body. Neurology would be the software of the computer. In this case, the software is programs and applications that are written in code, and the point of that is to utilize all of the physical components that make up the hardware. Here, the issue isn't with the computer's physical structure, but how the software manages those tasks. Similarly, if you have hardware in your body that can go into a certain range of motion, but your nervous system doesn't have the ability to function at that range, we would have more of a neurology issue. So now that we know the differences between each of these restrictions, let's go over which issues present themselves in each. The first issue we have is a closing angle joint restriction. Now, let's define a joint as a space between two bones, and how those bones move relative to each other is going to dictate how well the joint moves in general. When a joint goes through a range of motion, we have what's called a closing side and an opening side. Now, typically, if we feel any restriction in the closing side angle, we can say that we'll probably have some kind of joint issue going on. Many people experience this in common exercises, such as when they go to a squat, they feel a pinch in the front of their hip at the bottom of the squat. When they go to an overhead press, they'll feel a restriction in the top of their shoulder. And another very common one is when people do push-ups, they feel a pinch in the front of their wrist. So if we have a closing angle joint restriction, essentially what we have is an issue with the capsule, right? The deepest stuff in the joint. So we want to start off by stretching and strength training that capsular tissue. For most joints in the body, this is going to be through rotational inputs. So for example, the hips and the shoulders, you're going to want to train internal and external rotation. For something like the spine, it's important to train flexion and extension first. Another thing that can help with closing angle joint restrictions are actually mobilizations done on the joint from a manual therapist. Now, if you decide to get these joint mobilizations from a therapist, I would recommend combining them with the strength rotational inputs that we mentioned earlier for the most effective approach. The second issue we have under biology is what we would call mechanical tension. So mechanical tension is essentially where we have disorganized tissue, what other people may call scar tissue, or maybe some people will say there's adhesions, and that can happen from a lot of times injuries, a lack of rehab from the injuries. It can also happen from improper movement or overloading that one line of tissue. So if you tear your shit, make sure you rehab it. When it comes to mechanical tension, remember we have poor tissue quality laid down. So our goal is to lay down better tissue quality. This will happen over time, but in order to do that, we want to first spend time at length. So we want to spend time stretching that tissue passively. In addition to that, we also want to incorporate isometrics at that end range. This has a powerful effect on trying to signal these cells around that tissue that's being affected to essentially recycle and generate into better laid down tissue. The other thing we can add with mechanical tension is eccentric motions. So eccentrics are basically going to length. They are the negative part of a motion, such as going down towards a squat or going into a split. These motions are very potent when it comes to helping improve the architecture or the organization of tissue. Now on the neurology side, there are two examples of limitations. The first example is what we call neurological weakness. So this is just another way of saying that the nervous system doesn't have a lot of drive or strength in that range of motion. Now, when it comes to range of motion, it's important that we distinguish two types. We have passive range of motion, also called your flexibility, and we also have active range of motion, also called your mobility. Where our concern is if you have a big gap between your passive and active. There are practices that have a lot of just flexibility, something like yoga, for example, where people are passively stretching, but they're not actually contracting or actively trying to control that range. You'll get what's called a lot of sloppy space, but you don't have a way to access that. Now, trust me, just because you've got space, you don't want it to be sloppy. I've dealt with a lot of people who have great passive range of motion, they also tend to be people that are in high amounts of pain. So neurological weakness, that basically means you're not strong enough in the end range. So that's going to require essentially strength training in that particular end range. So we can do this with exercises such as lift-offs and holds and hovers in a very specific range of motion. As you get more control and better in that, all you need to do is progressively overload it. So add weight to that. And over time, that's how you start to improve your neurological weakness. Last issue of a neurological limitation is going to be what we call neurological tightness. Now, this is where the nervous system is preventing the hardware, the biology, from going in a certain range of motion with either a pain signal or a tightness signal. So this can happen because of injury. For example, you sprain your ankle, and the first thing your nervous system is doing is trying to protect it from further injury, so it limits that range of motion. Another common example that we have is, let's say you are sleeping in a new bed, or maybe you're out camping, you don't have a pillow that you're used to, and then you wake up with a really stiff neck. Well, chances are you didn't injure yourself in the night, but because of the way your body position was and the tension that you were getting, your nervous system was essentially protecting you, and that's why you can't look left, for example. So you have a neurological barrier there. So how do we overcome neurological tightness? Well, if we remember that the nervous system is guarding us from that range of motion, what we have to do is try to convince it that we have control and essentially reduce the threat that it perceives in that range of motion. The first thing we can do is go to that range of motion that feels tight and start to incorporate some deep breathing exercises. Think of like a 4-second inhale and 8-second exhale, just something real slow so you can start to down-regulate that perceived threat. Not only do you have to learn how to relax, but you also have to learn how to contract. So performing isometrics at that end range, and then increasing the intensity of those isometrics will, over time, show your nervous system that you not only feel comfortable in this range of motion, you can generate tension and therefore be safe in that range of motion. Combining that will help you reduce your neurological tightness. Because we can have a mix of limitations in any given area of the body, a hybrid approach is always going to work best. This is exactly why we created our Learn Mobility membership. Our classes integrate all the strategies discussed today, combining passive stretching, progressive overload, body control, and end range training to overcome both biological and neurological limitations. Check out this next video if you want to see how all these techniques come together in a class.